Hello everyone, today we talk about courtly art during the 12th-13th century, covering chiefly England and France. We speak not much of a history of art proper, but let's say in the role of patronage in and cultural influences broadly meant, and more, of course, on cathedral building, and especially in Gothic style, and looking a bit of a historiographical perspective in here, and trying to realize the important differences that exist in this art that for a consistent amount of time, still today, in part and rightfully, right, from even from a historiographical point of view, but not completely, not, wholly realistically, being considered like a bit the copy of the same thing, right, especially stemming from the Ile-de-France and its particular, the Capetian ideology that was, by the 13th century, radiating all over Europe. This is importantly connected to the concept of patronage because even in here it wasn't just a royal influence, right? Surely the spread of these imposing cathedrals, mostly in Northern Europe, also in Italy this time, the professionalization of architecture, the growing influence of master masons is objectively one of the single most even just macroscopic. It's also one of the relatively few visible relics of our medieval past. If you go to Europe, you realize at a certain point the civilization in less than 2 centuries brought up this 80 enormous buildings that were essentially expressing a new vision of the world, a new confidence, a new capacity, understanding, intelligence, right? It was properly a civilization that was blooming. And of course, there are unitary characters to this, but at the same time, their building was much more complex than it seems in terms of prompts, of simulations. For example, the role of the cities here. It's evident that the cathedral is built in the city at this point, and that the urban professional, rather than monastic organizations at this time, are responsible for labor force, for the craft, for the technology, and so on. Naturally, cities were rising at the time, so even in there, properly urban art production starts expanding properly from within the city. And we can spot here proper capitals that are being born, right? If you pick Paris, for example, it's not that it wasn't an important center otherwise, but we can consistently say that one of the main reasons, if not the most important one for which it rose, the largest cities in Europe and the theological capital in the West, etc., is because of the role of the Capetian monarchy that had chosen Paris already for these capabilities, but the fact it was becoming literally a center for which was spreading new culture. Think about the illuminated manuscripts, just for the sake of serving the needs of its university. At that point, was gathering ever more people. Recently, we were looking at we made a video the other day on the production of the first printed books, and we observed how certain levels of standardization had already been achieved in previous times, including 13th century Paris. In fact, these manuscripts, they were fundamentally the small Bibles that were growing increasingly standardized in form and content to satisfy this urban environment. In Italy, we have seen the city-states towards the 1300 encouraging, as governments, the supply of panel and wall paintings in the service of communal patronage of church and civic buildings. The organization of painters' workshops. At this point, about Giotto, our major artists in Western civilization, that appear as fully now professional forms, albeit the guild structure was still not dominating at the time. But surely there is a dynamism that and a great continental dialogue at this point, different influences coming from different parts of Europe and very, very close in this especially western axis from the northwest to the center-south of Europe fundamentally. But coming specifically to the role of the capitals of Paris and London, here we have already framed in many other videos the role of the French and English kingdoms, right, and what they're representing in Europe at this point, in a way that these are properly feudal monarchies rising even with a national profile, where capitals begin to play really an important role. London is an older and say proper capital even than Paris. Today, talking about Gothic art, and I promise we will do it more, in the sense of history of art at some point. But even in here, we will realize that what we call Gothic actually had more roots in England, right, in the 12th century rather than France itself. And this is even not just from an architectural point of view, but even in the type of writing, in a different unitary vision that was proper actually, with all, of course, the intersections, the overlapping with France, then the same Capetian monarchy, and still they were sharing, of course, so much, even just by proximity. So Paris and London, in their role of major centers of power, and gradually going towards the properly the greatest centers. In fact, in England that's more evident, right? London will rise fundamentally to be the only major center, if we can, speaking even just look at demographic terms with the other ones. France is different. France is more varied, and it's still building a unitary kingdom at this point. As you know, the English actually, the English monarchy is controlled sometimes at a point here, but way more actually territories in France than the same French king. But we'll digress in this because there were important influences also, of course, from Aquitaine, from the Occitanian world. We don't have to underestimate even the imperialistic English ambitions of the Angevins. But their importance rises at this point, properly in terms of artistic economy in itself. The Ile-de-France is undoubtedly the center from which Gothic will radiate, but not just through that, en masse, through also many other areas of Europe, like Germany, like Italy, Spain, and so on. But let's say, and not together from that point of view, but as a broader political model, as you know, will reach its peak, as we will see now, under the time will be denied, right? The Ile-de-France has this extremely rich, fertile soil that also provides certain specific ground, the sort of terrain for extraction of the materials that were used for building cathedrals. It had this major lay and ecclesiastical lordships that could invest into this new building. So these are all the factors we will look at when speaking of the origins of Gothic. But here we concentrate specifically on the Parisian level of, let's say, specialization and wealth in terms of practical art within the city community, right? The crafts, the masters, the resources that we can easily get even just from, tax records in the 1300, when you see that these communities paid a freaking lot of money because they were big. They were important. Just think about what a cathedral at the time could entail in terms of sheer capacities of moral and material resources. An enormous power, right? That naturally intertwined with the one who say monarchy, and which surely were a major factor in here. The presence of a royal court. Considered that. In spite of the fact that kingship was administratively still largely itinerant, right? This is no centralized state, courts moved, right? But if you look at cities like Paris, Westminster, Prague in the 14th century, these were emerging as both as practical and symbolical centers of power, right? That had to embody, in a sense, what the realm was about, politically, spiritually. And this has brought historiographically sometimes even to minimize the attention towards properly the art schools within the courts proper. That is to say, the influence here was so big from all strata of society that, after all, the courts didn't have much of an impact there. This has been overlooked. Like, there's a completely different attitude, for example, from the that scholars had towards the earlier court of Charlemagne or the Ottonians, where there is a deep attention just by tradition historiographically towards the idea that those courts were kind of the thinking, they were the brains in practice of the broader cultural reform and so on. By the 13th century, paradoxically, even though this unitary view of Gothic emerged, the role of court arts schools and production is probably underestimated. It was probably a project, a plan in that regard. And this, these schools, these centers, however, were specifically tied to the city, to the milieu of the city at large. Right, so that is where also the same artists, where the court artists was drawn, most of the cases, where the greatest concentration of idea and of criticism and capacity here was concentrated. The rest of the world was basically just countryside, right, peasantry. These centers were unique in their kind, historically speaking, especially in their distribution. Right, the ancient world hadn't seen like that. Medieval cities were much more populated than the ancient ones. They were much more, productive, proper, and so, in spite of this complex picture, let's say that the study of 13th century, especially French art, Capetian art, has tended to, let's say, focus, especially in relation also with the other centers of Europe, so on a broader scale, about the absolute centrality of seigneurial patronage. This happened for reasons that are acceptable at some levels. I mean, the idea that France, as also we have described it in our videos compared to other countries, was like a big seigneury, right? It didn't have, for example, the same level of centralization, of unity, let's say better, of England in proportion, right? It had the largest seigneurial power in Europe, this is easily seen by the concentration of wealth in the hands of very few people that in this sense managed as major magnates, but it's broader. These were princes within the same kingdom, if not kings within the same kingdom by certain standards. So obviously, French politics, society, art, whatever, was surely dominated by this, right? But this has, however, spoiled, conditioned excessively the theories about the development and spread of Gothic style specifically. These ideas started, for example, as a French scholar, Robert Fautier, wrote, it is a fair assumption that the prestige of the Capetian monarchy helped to create a preference for the artistic styles favored in the royal domain and the great royal city of Paris. Right. Robert Branner, who was influenced both by Fautier and the German scholar Seidel-Meyer, expanded on this concept and achieved important historiographical place, discussing the birth and development of the Rayonnant style in and around Paris. Right, this is a style of Gothic church emerging fundamentally around the 30s of the 13th century. It takes its name from the radiating spokes of the newest rose windows. Right, they are very famous, and you surely have seen them all, know what we're talking about. Well, as this phenomenon, according to Branner, would have been a sort of this became dominating and kind of the emblem of the Capetian monarchy at the peak of its power, because at this point France becomes really France, in the sense that the French, the Capetians managed to kick out the English, the Angevin influence, and they even conquered Occitane. They create the greatest power in Europe at that point, and this style, of course, embodies that grandeur, right? Especially under the kingdom of Louis IX. But Branner basically interpreted this, the development of this style, as essentially courtly phenomenon, right? That as if the court basically was the core, where the vanguard of artistic development was assumed, kind of stripped also from the clerical patrons that up to that point, considering that the cathedrals had already been built, had been the major commitments for it. That those who had embellished their especially in the northeast of France, that is the core of cathedrals in that sense, were these major prelates that had built massive in alliance with the Capetian monarchy. That, you know, it's true, essentially this bond that they made it together, the idea that they were backing one another. But it had been mostly a clerical thing. In fact, it's fascinating. We were seeing it, even the video we made recently about the castles, costs, constructions compared to cathedrals. We see that cathedrals arrived before the great castles built by the monarchy, because in a sense certain ecclesiastical lordships were already more powerful. At least, there were different, of course there are different types of buildings with different types of focus. Also the monarchy founded these buildings, of course, but they let's say there was properly a scope, an ecclesiastical scope of the first cathedrals. Here Branner essentially said, no, the monarchy takes over. They monopolize that, and this new style, the Rayonnant style, begins to embody fundamentally a kind of direction coming just from courtly artists and the new vision of the monarchy, right? So this entailed, for example, all the major constructions of the time: the Cathedral of Chartres, the rebuilding of Saint-Denis, and of the Sainte-Chapelle under Louis IX. We're talking about essentially the 40s of the 13th century in Paris proper, of course, and on a broader scale, continental scale, according to Branner. So the French system of courtly building spread in other centers that were developing in turn, comparable, monarchies, not quite the size of the French one, but still, imposingly. In England, Germany in part because actually it was fragmented at the time, but Spain, think about Castile, was instead booming during the same years. Forget Las Navas. At the expense, this is an idea, as a sort of broader homogenizing factor, at the expense of local traditions, as if the French, this broader Frankish civilization, Western Frankish civilization, expanded, boomed in all the world. This is so. As a consequence, all the great churches of the 1240s in Northern Europe, so Westminster Abbey began in 1245, the Cologne Cathedral began in 1248. That was not a monarchy, but a hell of a ecclesiastical principality in Germany, as you know, and one of the largest cities in Europe. So, once again, the urban environment would have been a sort of expatriated variant of the French court style, right? The symbol of France's absolute cultural hegemony over the European continent in this emanation, say, of the greatness of Saint Louis' reign. Now, much of this view is technically correct. This is the same dynamic as we have described the process. France is definitely the the cultural center of Europe at this time. It presents this broader political and social model that is exported. There is a feudalization of European culture at this point through the Western Frankish model. The spread of Gothic art is started like this, right? The penetration in areas like Germany or Italy that had either no much of a of a previous development, or they had different styles, even in the same Iberian Peninsula. This is something that is real, of course. The point here we're criticizing is the fact that this style, this influence, aside from the fact that it was not homogeneous, but not just in the points of arrival, but just in France specifically, but it wasn't just even a courtly production, right? It didn't stem uniquely from one single unitary vision. Doesn't matter how strong universalism was at the time. This was the moment in which monarchies were exactly struggling for giving that unity. And from a cultural point of view, whenever you see this great emphasis on ideology, historically speaking, that's one of the moments which probably the most difficult, when it's not the moment when that ideology was achieved properly as an homogeneous one, but in which it was being enforced, stressed, emphasized for the sake of its spread and affirmation. So that's this would require a powerful digression, but that we don't have time for, because of course in this 13th century, in Gothic art, in the Capetian monarchy, we see most of what the Middle Ages has been as a civilization. This is obvious. But we have always to consider that also within that same world, things were way more complex, way more different, way more properly diversified and heterogeneous in the first place. It was a moment of struggle and also opposition to these models at a certain point. So we cannot, however, look at Brenner's argument and pretend that this analysis actually takes into consideration the broader artistical, political, ideological, historical picture in full, right? It doesn't take into consideration the broader environment in this all, which is very more, that defines better actually the same idea. If you look at it more closely, it makes you appreciate more in this imposing unity that was conferred. However, the differences that existed within the same, that reveals you a lot about how that same system worked, right? So here the prejudice is conceiving patronage as just an appanage of the French court, as a mono-style productive model, right? As if the clerical classes had been wiped out of the scene, right? And the new Rayonnant Gothic church had been a completely brand new invention put there by this brand new monarchy that also emerged on who knows what. It doesn't sound much, right? There is also a criticism relatively to the broader internationalist view. I mean, the idea that the French model took really over everything else, and that, other countries kind of were patrons of the same French system, which it's evidently not true. So even from the local differences we can spot, and of course I'm extremizing the thing to make you understand what's the two opposites we are swinging in between. But looking at local differences in the various countries where eventually the Gothic spread, we can understand better how more contingent and locally built this style was. There were, interestingly, from a historiographical point of view, Branner's ideas were resumed by other scholars, such as Bonis, who interpreted also later developments after during the 14th century, for example, as the moment in which the architectural hegemony of the French Gothic had been exhausted. The Carpathian Kingdom enters in sort of crisis together with French cavalry and so on, these great big symbols, even as the Battle of the Golden Spurs, the broad economical crisis, eventually 100 Years' War, and that instead England, basically, under the impetus of its own court and its own style, right, of Gothic, even in here, the same mental pattern copied. It's the court that invents its own style and spreads it everywhere, and nothing else counts in the meanwhile. Nothing else comes from before, or as an autonomous, pre-existent factor, right, or contingent factor, maybe had nothing to do with the French influence. But no, England grows importantly in the 14th century, so it takes over the lead of this artistical development, and so it is. This is not realistic either. So this just dialectically doesn't hold, right? Can we actually say that in England or in France there was a specific courtly idea that had been formulated as a module, right, and that was exported, replicated in architecture, figurative arts, and just not depending on other factors? It's not really like that. First of all, the introduction about the urban environment there is important, because it makes you understand that the city provided with very different backgrounds just from the royal one. There was an actual alliance between the monarchy and these specific centers, because they also helped to counterbalance the influence of the high nobility, of feudal nobility, especially in these countries, was, as we've seen, more developed. But surely there was a difference in this regard, because the same monarchy derived from that feudality. Cities had fundamentally another culture, right? There was, of course, a lot in common also with clerical patronage, just not in terms of properly artistic model, but by cooperation, by sharing the same resources of alliance, of political, not just support, but sometimes even competition, that of course brought these models to imitate each other a little bit, to say, okay, look, I can do that too, and even better, right? So this is all part of civilization booster, but obviously stresses from one side we'll see it now, different models actually are coexisting, not just the proper imitation, but also the declaration through those models of important differences. Banally, if you look at the court buildings of Louis IX's reign in France, such as the chapel at Saint-Germain-en-Laye in the 30s, or the extraordinary Sainte-Chapelle in the 40s in Paris, you don't see much similarities there. Actually, they look pretty different, and consistently different. Nor we have, at this point, anything from even the French court manuscripts, such as the Bible Moralisée, right? There were, for example, the devotional psalters, right? That present any kind of unity or homogeneity or uniformity, as it would be instead, for example, more evident in the 14th century under the Valois, that were struggling pretty hard, of course, to maintain control to all the defeats they collected against the English. When they began to fund and to homogenize, in this sense, also royal libraries, also important investments for the sake of kind of a national uniformity in the struggle against the English. So all things that were taking place, but in the 13th century, it's still about the monarchy and say style for self building, right? So it was a moment that went by attempts, and there was in becoming, in a sense. It was still, you know, contingent, if you want. The same can be said for England. For example, look at the most important movement, we could say, of that royal patronage, that is Henry III's Westminster Abbey, begun in 1245, which is pretty unique in its kind, and it began, you know, it was diversified also along its own construction. Would this be kind of a copy of French models, right? It's sure there is a reference to that. There's an imitation, but both architecturally and ideologically, there are many more differences, and the work is much more unique in its own kind. First of all, we have to consider, just from a methodological point of view, that the European aesthetical values at this time were, as always, all one with a broader political view. Sometimes not just of secular power, but of, you know, ecclesiastical power. The variety of in art, for example, the diversification was typical of the richest patronages. Let's say at all level, not just, you can make a sharp division between ecclesiastical or royal, right? It was mostly the monastic debate around the decorum that had essentially brought on the fore the idea that simplicity matched with poverty, right? Whereas complexity and diversity with wealth. So the same symbolic density was, if you want, the characteristic of the most powerful, and of course of those who were also being criticized in the rise to power, in the structure of these new polities. And so these are two models that compenetrated each other. But when you look at these great cathedrals, of course, they are the product of diversity, of this great, this great power, so the same monarchy, as we have seen. So they are very articulate, they're very differentiated, and this brings, at the level of cathedral, in fact, to that diversification we can spot. An example of this is the adoption by Henry III and Edward I at Westminster Abbey of 13th century Roman mosaics, the cosmat pavements of papal character for the floors, famously, the tombs, and even the shrine of the English patron St. Edward the Confessor. We're talking about the 60s and the 70s of the 13th century. This can be explained through the Mediterranean ambitions, actually, of Henry III's foreign policies, broadly speaking. I mean, as a reach of political influence, Henry III was a hell of a ruler, actually. And also the crusading activities and imperialist policies of Edward I, that was looking at the church, but also the Romanity of the empire, as it's proven by the imitation of the Theodosian walls for the major castle built at Caernarvon by Edward during the Welsh campaigns. So more broad, and consider that, you know, in terms of crusade, they actually also entered in contact with different political models and so on. But here there is also properly a monarchical ideology. Like, if you look at Henry III's tomb, that's kind of papal type, right? Which emphasizes a quasi-clerical conception of monarchy. That is something that, incidentally, England, if you read The King's Two Bodies by Kantorowicz, will actually develop even before France. That is kind of more famous in that regard for late Middle Ages, especially the early modern age, and that was instead adopted during the third phase of the 100 Years' War. During, by the way, the English rule in Paris itself. So the reason here also a competition of the English sovereign with French power, right? And the French Angevin and papal ideology that at this time were closely connected. So much, in fact, that the portrait, the same workshop that produced the funerary image of Henry, might have been influenced by the major Italian sculptor Arnolfo di Cambio, that is famous for having depicted, immortalized both Charles of Anjou and Boniface VIII, right? And this reminds us that actually the first clear evidence of such of the hiring of specifically Roman painters in north of the Alps by royalty at that level was by Philip IV at the end of the same century. That we're talking about Caesaropapism, and the broader, literally imperialistic and even theological prerogatives claimed by Philip IV over the same papacy, right? So the clericalization of the French crown, the idea that Philip IV had this very hieratic appearance that had to represent the symbolism of this sanctity of the church. Here, naturally, the role of King Saints was very important in broadly speaking. Think about Louis IX in that case, but also in the case of England with Edward the Confessor. And the interesting thing, in fact, is that this broader reference to the Romanity and the could say the papality at the same time, because technically Philip IV wanted to be head of the church in France, right? So the fact that Henry III's effigies in Westminster has similar characters to this more hieratic figures by Arnolfo di Cambio may sound as if the English were trying to imitate the same French papal model that was taking kind of a universal character. The 13th century is the apex of papal hegemony over Europe. Henry III was son to John I that had given had saved technically the kingdom of England by giving it becoming vassal of the papacy. John I was actually a great monarch. And therefore, all that push for these models, for this sanctification, even of courtly rituals and images and so on, had naturally left its mark. And they went beyond the same kingdom's boundaries at this point. So it was an effort of substantiating the claims of power through the imaginary of other contemporary powers. And this passed, as we've seen, with art forms and images for royal and papal patrons that couldn't be distinguished, if you want, at this point. So there is definitely an international dimension here, but one that absolutely doesn't fit a monolithic, stylized picture, right? It's all different environments that come together, competing with each other, creating a synchrosis at some point, but also having different characters locally, right? And surely at this point in the 13th century, is there a growth in the ideas of universalism and even authoritarianisms, because the monarchies are finally giving themselves kind of starting at least to give themselves a statal character and a more coercive capacity to create a stronger authority. They manage to control ever more tightly the kingdom's communities. So these styles are actually emerging among the same aristocracy at large, because this is co-opted and inserted and framed within the new institutional structure. And we find a big deal of local, but let's say even in here there's some common background. Think about the Arthurian canon. It's something, I mean, that between Britain and France, it's mostly British, of course, but it kind of had a Celtic substratum. The French go crazy for it. The Germans as well, the Italians as well. I mean, it's something that spreads in literature, in models, in pictures. Naturally, also Bible narratives that are starting also being translated into vernacular and ever more illustrated. There are even historical works. There's a historical propaganda, historical narrative to say, to back, especially the legitimacy of the lineages and of, say, monarchy. For example, in England, Henry III and his queen had painted the crusading deeds of Richard Lionheart on their palace walls. There was an illustrated geography taking on ever more popular and pastoral, and therefore properly, public themes, let's say, in an edifying sense, which naturally was, to compel also the communities for orthodoxy. At this point, the creation of these monarchies, together with the strengthening of the papal one, passed through the suppression of heretical movements. So the monarchies became promoters of the same ideological pictures, even because the visuality here, majority of people was illiterate. So as you know, even the cathedrals are kind of, from the outside especially, big comic books where there are all these figures, these stories. People didn't know how to read, but they looked at these statues, the pictures that they're represented in the context, etc., and then they recognized the stories that they knew, because that's what most people knew, orally and so on. So this visual dimension, and also connected to the oral one, to this cognitive one that we can't reconstruct well, but it's pretty frequent in here. France and England stressed, as we were saying before, the importance also of their great national saints, such as Saint-Denis, St. Thomas, and St. Edward, that were commemorated often in the beautiful stained glass cycles that can be observed in the cathedrals, and naturally in the illuminated manuscripts as well. Sometimes were, as we have seen also recently, were true works of art, enormously expensive, and dedicated even here to a broader, let's say, to a broader reach, political and ideological alike. The lives of royal saints such as Louis and Edward the Confessor celebrated at this point the respective national ideas in the two countries. They both stressed naturally cohesion and the ideals of royal conduct, but they were different on the base of the two kingdoms.
It was obvious even in here the emphasis placed on the continuity of monarchical and dynastic legitimacy, right? It's obvious that the Plantagenet dynasty at this point wanted to reinforce the continuity with Anglo-Saxon links, let's call it in this way. The after time of pretty strong political instability, as you know, Henry III working hard on that, and the same sanctity of the monarchy with having a saint in your dynasty was a big deal. But not just from these times on. It's been something back in the day, and was kind of a, you couldn't sanctify everybody at the time, just because you wanted it. It doesn't matter how powerful you were, right? So even in there, you see that there are connections with other environments, other classes, let's call it in this way, communities, groups, polities that would wanted something in return, and that influence in the process, right? The genealogies at this point were emphasized. In the 1290s, Philip IV had
commissioned for the Great Hall of the Palais de la Cité in Paris these immense sculpted genealogy of the various kings of France. And there was also an important connection with Rome for papal recognition of the various cities' important apostolic past. I mean, the sanctity of certain figures that had been connected to the cities, that the same saints that had at the end of the day founded the same dioceses, locally speaking, were also, think about Saint-Denis. I mean, the French monarchy, as you know, the most powerful, is vassal to the Abbey of Saint-Denis, right? That's how far the spiritualization, the ecclesiastical link really was, right? I think about Clovis baptism and all the deep influences still at this point actually Roman Church had over these monarchies, as we reminded before, to say, you can't do all what you want if the Pope disagrees. So it was a way of reciprocal legitimization. And this is particularly, however, easy to spot in France after especially the second half of the 13th century. I mean, where the French intervene in Italy, and there is this broader, this axis. This is a huge crescent, basically, of French power and allies from the Channel up to the Latin Empire, fundamentally. So it's really a big deal to have this high ties. It's not something that every power can afford. There was also a lot of self-replication of these ideologies through teaching, right? The royal image systems, in this sense, were not properly much of a popularly oriented, right? They were aimed mostly at the court itself, so at an absolute elite level of the higher nobility. So, because that was also the one that actually commanded in the kingdom, so the people in Paris might have been kept happy in one way or another, but it's not that they literally changed the balance of the realm, compared at least to the aristocracy. That needed at that point to be reminded that there was a monarchy forming now, that the king was not just like in the previous centuries a first among equals. There was something more to it in terms of sheer power and international recognition and these images. And there is also kind of a psychologistic approach to these figures, medieval art, for the sake of political, with the impression that these images had to transmit, to instill. And it's a beautiful art, by the way. And there was naturally a spread of other means, texts, images, also at lower level. And there was specifically a royal hagiography that also contributed at the level of pastoral self-understanding. They used to say, let's realize that we do need a monarchy to guide the people. We need a shepherd who protects his flock, and that was fundamentally the deal of the monarchy at the time, and an eminently military and judicial capacity that naturally embodied the same divine power, right? There were reflexive homilies on power itself. To start taking an image, it kind of becomes that immortal hypothesis of a power that is literally embodied at certain point by someone like the king, that even when dies, leaves this spirit going on, to be clothed by another person, but it remains alive, immortal, and that had to represent that perfection, a sort of perpetua sanctio, because even if these were, importantly changing times, it's still, the world grew, very slowly. So there was, of course, in those times mindset, a greater
predisposition to fixed standards, to the idea that the regime more or less had always been like that and had to remain like that. That's the equating divine perfection, because admitting a change in that sense would have, or a decline, would have been admitting the undeserving nature of that regime, of that ruler. Hence, also the splitting of the kind of conceptual idea and the actual fact that these, however inherent even to the same biblical logic in practice. Obviously, this was naturally the positive picture emanated by the monarchy. But there was a response from the rest of society that naturally also contained criticism, and an ever more sophisticated one, because naturally the public face of an authoritarian rule had to, to be able to absorb also important blows, and to know how to respond to true opposition. So also the dialectic, the rhetoric, ideologies were ever more sophisticated, and this boosted civilization in turn, right? Ethics, this is the great century of Aristotelianism, at the moment in which was integrated, in fact, into Christian theology, and this current spread the already known, but at this point, in fact, re-emphasized mirror literature. Think about Gilles of Rome's Liber de Regimine Principum, written under the influence of St. Thomas Aquinas, that was translated in around 1280 into French at the behest of Philip IV, right? And this text could be also illustrated. The Augustinian tradition also commented on, let's say, the evils of tyranny to avoid. This is to be found on about the English court, for example, from the work of Giraldus Cambrensis, Walter Map. There is a manifest iconography in the 13th century related to the Old Testament kings. Also the bad ones, to say, look, those are the ones you do not have to be like, so watch out in case you are. It's to be found in the adornments of the Palace of Westminster, made in the 90s of the 13th century. So you understand the various influences that played at all levels in the construction of this ideology. And when you look at cathedrals, especially their decoration and so on, you realize, in just architectural differences, you see how truly different these pictures are. How not just built, because of course we completed cathedrals like Saint-Denis in the 19th century, because by the end of the 13th and in mid-14th it was big cracked. There wasn't even resources to keeping built most of this stuff, so things stopped. But surely the building was very complex, not necessarily continuous thing already before. There's important literature in here that also is directed to the king itself, but also boosted by it's kind of a self-teaching, edificatory manner, such as the late 13th century Dominican Somme de Roi. The notion of the ideal court is expressed by Jean de Joinville, one important nobleman of the time, who accompanied Saint Louis in his life, in the crusade and so on, and wrote about his life, an important biographer, which was mocked in turn, however, by a few years afterwards, in the beginning of the 14th century, by the Parisian Roman de Fauvel, that actually pictures the exact opposite what an ideal court is, and describes this moral reprobates, perverts, sycophants, and so on. But the French model, however, does get exported. A conclusive note to never forget, however, how there was a real impact of Western Frankish, that are properly French, because that's also what they changed the name of the kingdom under Philip Augustus, to stress that specific identity in an omnicomprehensive sense, not just also
a local one, just through the vernacular, that spread elsewhere. It's unavoidable to quote Brunetto Latini's Trésor, written in the 1260s, that was dramatically important to spread in central Italy during the 13th, the models of civic art that would influence the same. In fact, Italian Gothic, we'll see in a wholly different video, that objectively did stem from royal circles of the French court. Alright, so for today we stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time.